Over the last 4 decades, China's economic boom has lifted millions out of poverty and set the country on a path to become the world's largest economy.
We observe an incredible rebalancing of the Chinese economy at a faster pace than anyone else.
But since President Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, critics say China has become even more autocratic.
我们要坚持党对人民军队的绝对领导。
He's tried to curb corruption, but has also cracked down on his rivals and invested billions in a bigger, stronger military, reflecting a more aggressive foreign policy.
将不惜一切代价维护自己的领土主权和安全利益。
At home, up to 1 million Muslim Uighurs are believed to have been interned by the Chinese authorities in so-called re-education centers.
This appears to be the most intensive social re-engineering effort of the Chinese state since the Cultural Revolution.
But my guest tonight disputes all this and believes China is a force for good in the world. I'm Mehdi Hasan, and I've come here to the Oxford Union to go head-to-head with Charles Liu, a Chinese financier, senior fellow at the Peking University and an advisor to the Chinese government. I'll challenge him on China's human rights record and ask him, is China's economic miracle sustainable, and what on earth is going on with the Uyghurs? Tonight, I'll also be joined by 3 experts. Steve Sang, director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, ANDREAS FULDA, a China expert at the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute, and Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, and a former interpreter for the late President Deng Xiaoping. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Charles Liu. Liu is the founder and chairman of investment company Hao Capital and a regular TV commentator on Chinese issues. Charles Liu, thanks for joining me on Head to Head. Chinese President Xi Jinping, whose government you've advised, said last year China is ready for a bloody battle against our enemies, and kicked off 2019 by ordering the People's Liberation Army to, quote, prepare for a comprehensive military struggle. With who, Charles?
There's only one country that is sending warships into Chinese territory, that is threatening China with all kinds of things.
The United States?
The United States.
But whenever I hear President Trump speak, he says how much he loves President Xi and how they're great pals.
But everything that he's doing, all the executive orders, the military budget, all of this is focused on challenging China's position in the world. China has 1 military outpost. US has 800.
It's interesting because you say the US is a threat and threatening China and China's reacting. It's funny because the US commander on the ground in the Asia-Pacific, Admiral Phil Davidson, in February told the US Senate the exact opposite. He says through fear and economic pressure, Beijing is working to expand its form of ideology in order to bend, break, and replace the existing rules-based international order.
Who's replacing rules of international order? Who's cracking down on WTO? Who's left the Paris Climate Agreement? Who's challenging the agreement that's reached with the Iranians? Who? It's not China.
I mean, you can make it all about America, and I'm not here to defend Trump's America, but the reality is that Chinese hawks, independently of the US, are on the ascendant in your country. On 20th of December, Chinese Rear Admiral Luo Yuan said the Chinese Navy should consider sinking 2 US aircraft carriers and killing 10,000 US service personnel. What the United States fears the most is taking casualties. We'll see how frightened America is.
Oh, I don't take these type of comments seriously. The chance of a war between the two sides is minimal.
Last year, the Chinese government announced its biggest increase in military spending for 3 years, even though you already have a defense budget which is bigger than the UK, France, South Korea, and Russia combined. And yet you announced the biggest increase for 3 years. This is not just about words.
Oh, when the US still continues to challenge, as they do, for entering Chinese territorial waters, however you look at it, the total amount, it is still insignificant compared to U.S. spending.
Insignificant, but you spend more than the UK, France, and Russia combined, 3 nuclear powers.
The 3 nuclear powers in terms of population, that's up to how many?
What's population got to do with your military spending? You have a big population, we know that. What's that got to do with your military budget?
Per capita spending is...
India has a huge population. They spend a quarter of what you spend.
They wish they had the money to spend more.
Okay. Let's talk about something where it doesn't directly involve the United States. The South China Sea arbitration. The Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague ruled in 2016 that Chinese claims to the South China Sea have no legal basis, and yet the Chinese continue to disregard that ruling. China is claiming more and more land, more and more resources, building more and more of these artificial islands, I think 7 so far. Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Brunei, the Philippines, they've all been upset with Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, with China taking these reefs.
All the discussion about South China Sea has been so-called freedom of navigation. When was it last time that you've seen a blockage of freedom of navigation? And when was the last time you heard the countries you've named, including Vietnam, raise an issue on China and South China Sea? It's only your friends, Americans and Australians, who are jumping up and down all over this.
It's interesting you should say that, because in 2018, a bunch of Asian countries, mainly your neighbors, were asked, would it be better to have, for the world, to have the US or China as the leading global power? 73% of Asian respondents, including Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, favored the US versus 12% for China. Even with Trump as president, 77% of Filipinos say they prefer US leading the world to Beijing. That's pretty damning. To pick Trump over China, that's pretty damning, I would argue.
That is. But in practical terms, I don't see these countries, in terms of their foreign policy and their governments, addressing the Chinese as a pure pull would seem to indicate.
Well, let's bring in our panel here to see what they think about this so far. ANDREAS FULDA is a German academic, a China expert at the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute. ANDREAS, should China's neighbors and the wider world be worried about this Chinese military build-up, this increase in spending?
Yeah, I think they should. And the truth of the matter is, if when Xi Jinping talks about China's national rejuvenation, it is worrisome because the underlying tenets are a radical revisionist and expansionist foreign policy, as evident from the artificial reefs in the South China Sea, but also his threat of annexing Taiwan, which is a liberal democracy, a very vibrant society, just opposite the coast of mainland China. And what I think his game plan is to project his power abroad to shore up his support at home.
Charles, just deal with Andreas' specific point about Taiwan. You were born in Taiwan, of course. Yes. If you still lived in Taipei today, in the Taiwanese capital, wouldn't you be worried at some of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing about annexation?
I wouldn't be at all.
Well, nothing.
Because I actually went to Taipei.
What does it take to worry you, Charles?
No, I went to Taipei for the midterm elections. What I see in Taipei or in Taiwan today is the people in Taiwan have gotten fed up with so-called independence politics. They're looking for better life. Well, why is it 170,000 engineers have left Taiwan and have gone to Shenzhen? Why is it all the 90% of the startups in Taiwan are aimed at the Chinese market and not the Taiwanese market? I think the fact that the economies have become so integrated between Taiwan and China, it leads to, let's say, the possibility of addressing the issue.
But my impression is that the young Taiwanese are actually quite worried that they may actually lose out in this process and also lose their de facto sovereignty as a liberal democratic island state.
But that is no longer considered a primary issue, even for the younger people.
Okay, let me bring in Steve Tsang, who's a British political scientist born in Hong Kong, currently director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Steve, is this a new form of aggressive foreign policy on China's part, or is that just an exaggeration on the part of China's enemies? What is China trying to do with its foreign policy? Is it trying to change the region, change the world?
After Xi Jinping became leader of China, what we are seeing is an assertive foreign policy that essentially amounts to China now requests and requires the rest of the world to pay China due respect. And what amounts to due respect is something to be judged by the Communist Party of China, or in effect by the leader of China, General Secretary of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping.
Okay. We've also got Victor Gao with us, one of China's best-known international politics experts, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, former interpreter for the late President Deng Xiaoping. You can't deny that the current Chinese president is taking different steps to his predecessor, is demanding respect on the regional and international stage.
China doesn't want to challenge the international order today, but China wants to have a better say, a larger say in the international order today. And I hope the rest of the world will respect China's request, because this is legitimate, this is legal, this is not revolutionary means to overthrow the international order.
Well, in the South China Sea, there's a debate about legality. Stephen, you're smiling there when Victor said they don't want to...
Well, China is not out there to change the international system as we know it at the moment, but it is transforming it. When the UN Agency for Human Rights was being changed, and then China played a leading role in the transformation, the creation of the Human Rights Council, and as it does so, it basically changes the discussions at the UN about human rights. Now China is not at much of the receiving end of criticism on human rights.
Charles, let me ask you this. One of the reasons so many people abroad are worried about Chinese foreign and defense policies right now is because you have a president who at home appears to be bent on increasing his own power and reach. Chinese presidents since Mao, as you know, tended to serve 5 or 10 years in office. But President Xi has cracked down on his rivals, refused to designate a successor, and last year got rid of term limits. He's gearing up to be president for life, isn't he? Dictator-in-chief.
Okay, 2 things. Number one, it's a one-party system.
We don't...
And thank God. The key issue for the Chinese government is that they tried very hard over the years to maintain stability. You're claiming this president for life thing is precisely you don't understand how the system works.
Okay, explain it.
Now, take Hu Jintao, for example. During his second term was seen as lame duck for the entire second term. And he couldn't implement or execute a lot of things that he wanted to execute. It doesn't mean that he's actually going to continue for another term, but that prospect would take out the possibility of being regarded as lame duck.
But it does give him the option to serve for life legally within the system.
If it goes in that direction.
He does seem to be going in that direction.
Not necessarily.
Okay. Quick question, though. On the vote last year in March, that was the vote in the National People's Congress to get rid of term limits, the delegates voted, 2,964 of them voted, 2 of them voted against. 2,959 voted in favor. Was that a free and fair election? I'm just wondering. I mean, 2,900 people just voted the way he wanted. Coincidence?
No, it was...
Is that how Chinese politics works?
Apparently, that's how it works.
Okay. Good to hear such an endorsement of the system.
I think you should not be addressing the Chinese entire system of how it works in comparison to what you have in the West. You have to remember that 50 years ago, 90% of the population were illiterate. Only 10% was literate, or sophisticated or educated. The whole process of transforming that into a modern society is taken a long time.
By the way, lots of Chinese people weren't happy with the 2 term limits, and they took to Weibo and other online forums, and they were not allowed to. In fact, the Chinese government disallowed the words personality cult, my emperor, 2 term limit, Emperor Xi. They were all not allowed to use those words online to avoid people's dissatisfaction with this move.
You read Weibo?
I don't read Weibo, but others who read it for me.
Okay. Now, there are comments, there are views and comments describing their views and comments on this issue.
They got shut down.
It's not true. It got shut down because I wrote something on this as well.
Well, you wrote something critical of President Xi on Weibo?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. What did you write?
I said, this would not be regarded well by the Western press.
That's your definition of a criticism of the Chinese president. Nicely done, Charles. We've got to move on. Time is short. We want to talk about the economy in part two. Before we do, there's another big domestic issue that's grabbed a lot of headlines in recent months. Your country, the government you support and have advised, according to a UN rapporteur, according to the US State Department, according to Amnesty International, according to Human Rights Watch, according to plenty of journalists, and many others, are believed to have detained maybe 1 million people or more, mainly from the Uighur Muslim ethnic minority, in re-education camps. 1 million people, Charles.
Okay.
1 million.
Okay. It's certainly not grabbing headlines in China.
Isn't that because you don't have a free press in China, so you can't have headlines about the Uyghurs?
No, it's because there are 55 national minorities in China, and Uyghurs' population is, in total...
9 and 10 million, I believe, in Xinjiang.
Yes, 0.7%.
Okay, but the world doesn't work on percentages. If you lock up 1 million people in camps, the world pays attention.
1.4 billion people need to be fed, need to be clothed,
What's that got to do with
need to be
locking up 1 million
educated.
people in Xinjiang? That must concern you to hear that 1 million people of your fellow Chinese countrymen and women have been locked
If
up by
it's
your
true,
government.
sure.
How do we establish if it's true or not? Why don't you let people in to check and count? Then we'll know for sure.
I think people have visited.
No, they've been on kind of supervised trips with Chinese monitors to select camps where they haven't been able to see everything. In fact, Reuters went on a trip last year. They were taken around. They were allowed to meet some people, and the people sang, "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands." And Chinese government monitors stood in the room the whole time, and no one was allowed to speak to anyone independently.
well,
you know, Charles, that there are people who've been in those camps, who have come out of those camps, are now refugees in the US, in Kazakhstan, and they have testified to hooding, shackling, torture, sleep deprivation, sexual humiliation, starvation. This is what's coming out from people who've been in those camps in Xinjiang.
If it's true, then they're certainly very bad. This is not my area of expertise, and I'm not involved in the politics, and I've never been to Xinjiang. I'm more concerned about the economic side.
But let me bring in Victor Gao, who is a very well-known Chinese political commentator. Even Chinese government officials have admitted that there are these camps, there are people locked up for quote-unquote re-education, but in the most horrific conditions, and we're talking up to 1 million people, Victor. How can you justify that?
The Uighur people are our brothers and sisters. I have many friends among the Uighur people. Among the Muslim people in China, they are a minority. Most of them are great Chinese nationals, that's for sure. However, among the Uighur Muslims, there are extremists, there are terrorists, and there are separatists who want to split Xinjiang away from China. In China, under the Chinese law, anyone attempting to separate any part of Chinese territory outside of China is committing a crime. We need to be fully aware of this legal issue. We cannot tolerate anyone to do
denying
that.
Some Uyghurs have been caught up in international terrorism. No one's denying that. I'm wondering, why not lock them up? Why lock up 1 million people?
First of all, altogether in Xinjiang, there is less than 10 million Uyghur people. If you are really serious in believing that there is 1 million people among the Uyghurs who are locked up in so-called camps, this is completely fabricated.
How many people are locked up?
I do not know.
Well, you can't say it's not 1 million if you don't have an alternative number.
There are several things. One is the definition of 1 million or less than 1 million, that's one thing. The other one is locked up.
Well, they're not there of their own volition, are they?
No, there are people in Xinjiang who are going through training or retraining for education purposes. There are people in
education
Xinjiang.
purposes. Khairat Samarkand, who was one of the people who managed to get out of a camp, he says that we were forced to sing political songs and study speeches of the Chinese Communist Party. We were forced to chant "Long live Xi Jinping" before we were given our meals. Many of us have tried to attempt suicide.
Allow me to say one thing for sure. No one in China is saying "Long live Xi Jinping." So whatever report you are quoting is false to start with.
Here's what I don't get, Victor. The UN, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the US State Department, various China experts, human rights activists have come up with this number of 1 million based on satellite photography, based on people who have come out and talked about it. You're saying it's not 1 million. I'm asking very simply, how many is it?
I think we need to just differentiate the realities on the ground versus the falsified claims.
So refugees, Uyghur refugees who've talked about being tortured in camps, they're just making it up, according to you?
I think lots of these claims are falsified.
Wow.
That's for sure.
And you're a friend of the Uyghur people. Okay, ANDREAS, FULDA, what do you make of Victor's response and Charles's responses so far?
I think it's, both what Charles and Victor said is indefensible, and let me explain. For a lot of people who support the Chinese Communist Party, cultural difference has to be dealt with by homogenization and assimilation. But let me give a human face to these people. There is a pop singer. He's famous for a song where he's encouraging young people to study hard, to do physical exercise, and to be courteous. He is not a terrorist, Victor. Or a second example, there is another gentleman. He was very promising footballer. Because he traveled abroad, he was deemed a potential terrorist. He's in a camp. He's not a terrorist. And the last but not least, and it's really important, the peace activist Ilham Tohti, very widely respected individual, he has always advocated that the predominantly Han Chinese should get along with the Uyghurs and vice versa. He was locked up for life for this kind of moderate advocacy on behalf of his own people. So I would say these three individuals need to be released immediately. The 1 million Uyghurs and Kazakhs need to be released immediately. There is no justification to bring so much harm to them and their families. They should be able to live in peace and free from fear.
Victor, what's your response to that? And Charles, you wanted to come in.
Do you know how many Uyghur fighters are fighting in
Definitely not a million,
Syria?
Victor.
5,000 people.
So why
And
not lock up those 5,000 people?
Each Uyghur fighter fighting in Syria has about 3 or 4 persons in their family fighting together.
How does 5,000 fighters go over to Syria?
Come on, Charles. Every country has had problems with fighters going out to Syria.
Okay.
France has endured far more terrorist attacks than China has.
Wait.
And the French have not locked up 1 million Muslims in France.
5,000. And how did they get there? There's a support group.
Same in France, Charles. And the French have not locked up 1 million people. They have a problem. The French claim they have a problem of radicalization. They've brought in a state of emergency, but they haven't detained 1 million people. But even the French haven't said, you can't name your son Mohammed. You can't have children entering mosques. Government employees can't fast during Ramadan. You can't grow, quote, abnormally long beards. That's what Beijing has banned Uyghur people from doing.
That's false.
How about children not being allowed to go into mosques?
That's totally false.
Why is it false? How do you know it's false?
Because
I've seen the photos of the signs. There are photos of the
I have a neighbor, immediate next door neighbor, who is Muslim and who goes to mosque with his children.
In Beijing?
Yeah.
He's not in Xinjiang. On the one hand, you say, don't ask me, I don't know anything about this. But then you jump in to say everything's fake. Stephen, let me ask you this. You're listening to Charles and Victor saying this is propaganda. What do we know? What does the evidence suggest to you that you've seen that can be corroborated about what's happening on the ground on a place like Xinjiang?
What we do know of the political system is that the Communist Party of China has a monopoly of the truth and a monopoly of history in China. Therefore, what they say must be true, is by definition, and what anybody else has to say that does not coincide with what the party says are false news. That is what we are dealing with. When we are talking about 1/10 of an identifiable minority in the home country being identified and put in camps, how would our friends here feel if 1/10 of the native population of Shanghai or Beijing are living in camps?
Charles, do you want to answer that?
I've never thought about that question.
Okay, but he's just posed it.
I just don't see it. I don't see it happening. I don't see it possible physically to spend this inordinate amount of time on something which many, myself included, don't feel to be truthful is, I think, negative propaganda on your part, Mehdi.
Here's what I don't get. On the one hand, you say, I don't know anything about this. On the other hand, you say, I believe it's untruthful. You can't have it both ways, Charles. If you don't know anything about it, maybe you shouldn't accuse other people of making stuff up. And you and Victor say it's all fake news.
Maybe there is some fake news there.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to leave the discussion. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back in part 2 of Head to Head with Charles Liu, with our panel of experts. We're going to hear from our patient audience here in the Oxford Union. We're going to talk about the Chinese economic miracle and about much more. Welcome back to Head on Al Jazeera. My guest today is Charles Liu, the financier, entrepreneur, informal advisor to the Chinese government. Undoubtedly, the Chinese economy has been a success story in many ways. Record growth, millions of people lifted out of poverty. I don't think anyone questions that. But there are, of course, as you know, serious concerns about the sustainability of the Chinese economic miracle, how long it's going to last. The jobs market's gotten a lot tougher. Exports and imports have slowed down. The Chinese stock indexes, I believe, lost almost a quarter of their value last year. Even the trade war with the US seems to be taking its toll. Are we witnessing the beginning of the end of the Chinese economic miracle?
I remember a book from 1998 by a top economist called The Oncoming Collapse of the Chinese Economy. And that's 1998.
Yeah.
2019, it's 20-some years ago.
Yeah.
There's been plenty of discussion about the oncoming collapse of the Chinese economy and the oncoming collapse of the Chinese financial system, the oncoming collapse of Chinese productivity. I'm afraid so far it's proven that it's
more
not
durable
there.
than people think.
The Chinese economy is transforming. It is moving from cheap labor manufacturing for Fortune 500 companies to a significantly meaningful domestic market and domestic consumption. Now, 6.5%, okay. I would say to my co-investors, even 4% is quite good because the base is so much bigger now.
Okay. One thing that's been a consistent trend in China that's just been getting worse and worse over the last few decades is inequality that seems to be spiraling out of control in your country. There were 89 new Chinese billionaires in 2018 alone. That's almost 2 new billionaires a week, while tens of millions of people still live in poverty. Why is a self-styled communist society producing so many billionaires and so much income inequality?
Well, I think it's the value creation in society as a whole. Deng Xiaoping said, let some people get rich first in terms of
I
development.
think Milton Friedman said something similar as well. I think capitalists say the same thing too, to be honest.
Exactly.
Trickle-down economics is now the Chinese way.
It's the Chinese socialist way.
Okay.
Is it trickle-down or is it something much more significant?
According to a recent study by the European think tank Bruegel, quote, the large and persistent income gap is partly the fault of China's tax and transfer system and, quote, very generous personal income tax allowance and exemptions that favor high-income individuals. You're a high-income individual, aren't you, Charles? You've benefited from this tax system, haven't you? While other Chinese haven't.
There are two aspects to this. New tax laws have just been implemented, which is supposed to be much more fair. Second is, it's very, very difficult to have a transforming society that is changing so rapidly and to have a taxing system that fits in every stage of development. If you look at China in the 1980s, early 1990s, it was basically cheap manufacturing, and then it moved into something else.
And yet today, the Article 1 of the Chinese Constitution still says that the People's Republic of China is a socialist state led by the working class. That's just a completely false description of China today. You're not led by the working class, and you're not really a socialist state.
Yeah, we're certainly not as socialist as Norway and Finland and Sweden. We prefer to look at what happens to the economy and whether or not people's livelihoods have been improved.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of the rich Chinese and what they're up to. The Huron Group, very well-respected research company, did a survey of high net worth individuals in China, rich millionaires and they found that almost half the number of rich Chinese are planning to move away from China to protect their fortunes and to get better educations for their kids. A lot of Chinese billionaires, millionaires, as you know, I mean, you keep going on about the West. A lot of the rich people in your country are obsessed with the West. They buy houses in the West, they send their kids to school in the West, they buy Western art at ridiculous prices. How come?
It's part of investment. I buy things in the West as well.
1 in 6 said they wanted to move because of the political environment in China. 1 in 5 said they want to protect their assets. 3/4 said they want their children to have a better education. Not a great vote of confidence in China from its richest people.
Okay, I have investments all over the world as well. It doesn't mean that I'm moving out of China. The number that you should look at is the number of students returning to China after getting an education in the West. Of course, with China vilification by the US, a lot of Chinese students are being pushed out of US schools.
I get how billionaire businessmen can send their kids abroad to study. How do you explain the president of China on a $22,000 a year official salary, paying for his only daughter to go to Harvard? How do you explain all these top Politburo officials who were on $22,000, $23,000 a year, sending their kids to some of the most expensive private schools and universities? How do they pay for that?
If you went purely by SAT scores, that 80% of the population of the UC system will be Asian. They happen to be better students and they get scholarships.
So did Xi Jinping's daughter get a scholarship to go to Harvard?
I don't know. I assume she could have.
Because you know that his family, according to a Bloomberg study, are found to be billionaires. His brother-in-law's name appeared in the Panama Papers. The Chinese political elite is riddled with corruption, as you well know.
And that's something that has been in the process of being addressed the last 4 years.
What does that say about your model that the Chinese government has rounded up 2 million people, Communist Party officials, have been disciplined for corruption in recent years?
Thank God that they've been rounded up.
And what about the president and the Politburo? He seems to only arrest people who are not in his inner circle. The people he likes never seem to get arrested.
Not true.
Really? Can you name an ally of the president who he's landed up recently?
Who's an ally, who's not? There are Politburo members who have been brought to charges.
Well, let's ask our panel. ANDREAS FULDA is here, China expert at the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute in the UK. You've advised German and European authorities on engagement with China. You're shaking your head when Charles talks about corruption. How bad a problem is it in China, and is it being dealt with?
Well, first of all, of course, it's very opaque. It's a dangerous topic to talk about. However, we know from the WikiLeaks and one of the cables from the US State Department that the Politburo Standing Committee is basically a cabal of business empires, and these individual members control whole industries. So what was alleged is that, for example, the now imprisoned security czar, Zhou Yongkang, that he basically controlled the oil industry. And for example, the case of the former premier Wen Jiabao, his wife, she apparently liked diamonds a lot, so she would control the precious gems sector. Now, if you think about carving up the economic pie like this, then thinking that this founder of Amazon is the richest man in the world, I think becomes a rather fanciful idea, because these members in the Politburo Standing Committee probably, and their families, are far richer than any individual outside China.
Victor Gao is with us, Chinese international politics expert, vice president of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, former interpreter to the late president Deng Xiaoping. How do you explain, as someone who's been around some of these people, you've been in their presence, where do they get all their money from if they're on 22 grand a year?
First of all, for the record, corruption in China is deeply entrenched. Secondly, as an institution and as a policy, the Chinese government, Chinese party, and the Chinese people cannot tolerate corruption. So whatever that's necessary to weed out corruption, to round out the corrupt officials, we will do. And this is exactly, as Charles mentioned, the Chinese system is doing over the past 5 or 6 years in particular to be relentless in chasing after these corrupt cases.
But it doesn't seem to be working.
That's number one.
Chinese overseas wealth has doubled between 2012 and 2018.
Yeah.
They seem to be getting away with offshoring all their assets.
Let me add another point. However, over the past 20 or 30 years, property price in China in almost all the cities has gone up significantly. So most of the urban citizens in China, to say the least about the government officials, can actually afford their kids send their kids to the best schools in the West, especially of the Chinese system of family relatives pooling up funds together to support the outstanding member. In China, many families
deal with
actually
Andreas's point that you have the former Prime Minister's wife controlling the diamond industry, you have different Politburo members controlling different sectors of the economy. How is that? That's socialism with a Chinese characteristic?
That's exactly what we were talking about before. Politburo members were held to task for these things.
I mean, the thing is, there was a report by the People Bank of China in 2011, and they found out that since the 1990s, 18,000 party officials, managers of SOE, like big state-owned enterprise, etc., had fled the country, and they took with them a whopping 120 billion US dollars. If you think about that kind of theft and looting of state assets, if that had been invested, let's say, in the Chinese education system or in China's health system, that would have alleviated a lot more poverty.
Let me bring in Steve Tsang, who's been waiting patiently, British political scientist born in Hong Kong, currently the director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. How bad is the inequality problem in China right now?
Could either of our very distinguished guests from China tell us what the Gini coefficient is in China?
This is the measure of inequality.
That is the measure of inequality. I studied China my entire career. I confess that I cannot tell you because that no such figure is available.
Why? Because the Chinese government don't want it to be available.
Maybe the party has collected them, but if the party has that information, it's top secret. It's completely classified. We are not allowed to know what it is.
Victor?
In China, many people are not very happy about comparing their wealth to their neighbors. However, one thing is true among the majority of the Chinese people, that is, if that person compares his own situation with his situation 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, everyone is better off. That's the mega trend. We need to keep focused on the great changes that's happening to everyone among the Chinese people. And that means every Chinese person.
Inequality is a major issue. You can't just dismiss it. And I just want to finish, Steve, deal with this point about where this wealth comes from and how they use it to spend abroad.
This problem of corruption is basically systemic. And the Chinese government under Xi Jinping has done a lot to deal with corruption. You quoted the 2 million figure overall. There is also a different set of figures, the so-called tiger figure. Tigers are basically vice minister and above rank senior leaders in the Chinese government. By the Western academic calculations, we calculate about just below 200 tigers has been brought down. The Chinese state media give a figures of closer to about 700. Amongst the 200 or 700 figures, name 3 who are people who had previously worked with President Xi, and why is it so difficult to name even one single one of them?
Charles, do you want to name someone?
You don't know who is.
We know who the 200 and the 700s are.
But you know, you can know who they are, but how do you identify who is in what camp?
We can look at their career. The party is very good with their career structures. Who had worked with President Xi when he was in Fujian province?
Your position is that people around President Xi have not been locked up for corruption. That's Steve's position. Can you dispute that? Do you have a person that can?
I don't have a view on that.
Okay,
No, I want to go back to something you said.
Yeah.
When you said that the amount of wealth that left China in the last 10 years or something.
Yeah, between 2012 and 2018 has doubled, I believe.
The GDP has doubled as well.
There are a lot of Chinese billionaires taking advantage of tax havens. I'm wondering how that's okay in a socialist country, supposedly.
You're defining socialist, you know, maybe.
How do you define socialism?
I think socialist is just a slogan.
Okay.
In reality, it's the Chinese way of doing things.
I'm glad we agree it's just a slogan for the Chinese. Okay, let's go to the audience who've been waiting very patiently. Raise your hands, wait for a microphone to come to you. Let's go to the lady here.
Thank you very much. I am Uighur. I have been cut off from my speaking to my family since beginning of 2017, just like many thousands of Uyghurs living overseas. And my question to you, Mr. Liu, does it really bother or concern you that the country that you made home after renouncing your Taiwanese citizenship is criminalizing the entire Uyghur people and implementing policies that major Western news organizations, lawmakers, and legal scholars have described as crimes against humanity? Thank you.
First of all, I have Uyghur friends. If it's valid that there are things which are not properly done, of course it's not good. Of course it's not good.
Earlier you said that it was propaganda from me. When you hear these stories, do you realize it's probably not best just to dismiss everything as propaganda?
I use propaganda because your abrasive, aggressive way of addressing it.
Okay.
Sorry.
So it wasn't about the substance, you just don't like my style. Okay, that's fine, I can live with that. The substance of it is, she's telling you what's going on, she can't speak to her family. Is that propaganda? I'm just asking. This lady said
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Victor wants to jump in. Go on, Victor.
No, for this outstanding lady, I would say if you are a Uyghur, I would treat you as a brother or sister, the same as I would treat the majority of the people among the Uyghur people. Secondly, if I can give you one piece of advice, I would say several things. If any of your Uyghur brothers and sisters and relatives are Communist Party members in China. Then, by party discipline, they are not allowed to go to a mosque. If they want to go to a mosque, fine, resign from the Communist Party of China. So the government in China has a discipline. If you are a Communist Party member of China, don't go to a mosque, go to the Buddhist temple, don't go to a Catholic church.
Before I go back to the audience, I need to ask you a follow-up on this. There are now reports, which haven't been really denied by the Chinese government, that the Communist Party that you talk about is sending Han Chinese people to live in Uyghur houses, to watch them 24/7 as they eat, drink, pray. Is that fake news as well?
There is no problem in believing in Islam. I have many Islamic friends.
Okay, you have Uyghur friends, you have Muslim friends, I get it.
No, however...
Do you have people living in your house against your will?
No.
Because a lot of Uyghurs do right now.
However, if anyone in China misuses Islam as a pretext to split Xinjiang away from China, that's a crime.
Are there people living in Uyghur homes in Xinjiang right now on behalf of the Communist Party?
That I'm not aware of. I've never been inside the family of a Uyghur friend.
Unfortunately, a lot of Chinese Communist Party members have. Let's go back to the audience. Let's take the lady there in the green scarf at the back. Yes.
You said 5,000 people went to Syria and fight. And my question to you is, how did you let them to go to Syria to fight with such a strict barrier? Every 100 meters, there are one checkpoint, and even though people can't go one town to another town, and such a strict surveillance, how did you let them to go to the Syria?
Victor, do you want to take that question?
Most of these Uyghur fighters now in Syria and previously and currently in Afghanistan have smuggled themselves out of China. So in that action itself, it's a violation of Chinese law again. There are smuggling activities bringing Uyghurs out of China through Myanmar, to Malaysia, for example. So this is a problem not only to China, but to China's neighboring countries.
ANDREAS, FULDA, you're here, a China expert. I just want to get your take on this. This argument about terrorism, is that a credible argument in your view?
Well, you yourself made the point that every country has to deal with extremism. The question is how you do that. I think this idea that you need to create this racial nation where ethnic difference is not tolerated, where cultural difference is not tolerated, and where religious activity is not tolerated. I think this is, for the lack of a better word, a rabbit hole that the Chinese Communist Party has gone in, where I'm not quite sure how they can get out, where the off-ramp really is. Because do you want to keep like 1 million Uyghurs in these camps forever? Or the next 5 years, or when do you release them?
I need to go back to the audience, but very briefly, Victor, how long do these camps stay open?
First of all, I do not agree with the premise of your question. There are more mosques being built as we speak than probably any other religious establishments in China.
Fine, let's go back to the audience. This lady here in the black shirt in the second row.
China still has a poor social security net, and working labor rights and working conditions of the poor workers are still a problem in China. I want to ask, how can these conditions be improved?
Charles.
There is a shortfall in the social security pool. There's no question. One of the ways that has been addressed has been the allocation of 10% of the shareholding of state-owned enterprises, many of which are listed companies either in New York or Hong Kong or in China, and to allocate that into the social security pool.
But isn't the problem that, again, coming back to this idea of socialism, slogan or not, in the beginning of the show, you were telling me, oh, India wishes they could spend what we spend on defense. But is that really something to brag about when you spend, I think, 5% of your GDP on health and 2% on education, which is lower than what Sudan spends on health and education as a proportion of the budget? That's pretty embarrassing for a country your size,
Absolutely.
your wealth, calling itself socialist, abandoning the poor people when it comes to health and education.
I think health and education spending should be more. In terms
Why hasn't it been?
It's been increasing significantly.
But why is it so low? In a country that claims to care about the working class.
It could be spending more, sure.
Let's take some more questions from the audience. Lady in the red shirt.
My question is, do you think that the rise in populism and the economic slowdown in the West is possibly a threat to China?
The rise of populism, ultimately, in a political sense, is a threat to the whole world. Because what we have in terms of the US, for example, and even Europe, is a challenge to the rise of Asia overall. It's not China. Because if you look at the 280 components for your iPhone, 270-something are made in Asia and assembled in China. and its efficiency is enhanced because of the market size. So this rise of populism in trying to move the supply chain from Asia back to the United States, it is a threat. It's a threat to the whole world, not just to China, because this supply chain and this market has been very beneficial for the whole world. This is how the West, including the US and Europe, has been able to get lower cost of living, lower and cheaper goods.
Okay, let's go. Gentleman who was waiting with the hat.
I lost contact with my old family since early 2017. And I recently found out my siblings, and they are in that so-called concentration camps. And I don't know, are they still alive or not? And secondly, I don't know my mother's, she is well, and why I'm not allowed to communicate with them, and also why they're not allowed to my mother and my relatives to contact with me, and why my mom must suffer from not seeing and hearing from their sons. Okay. That's my question.
That's a statement. I have no idea about his
well, let me turn it into a question. When you hear such stories, aren't you concerned as a citizen of China as to what might be going on in your country?
Yes, I am.
And when you go back to China, you're going to do anything about it?
I'll find out more about the subject.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. I said at the back.
Personally, do you believe that China's notion of human rights is fundamentally different? And if so, how would you define China's human rights policy?
Okay, good question.
I think cultural differences are there. In terms of human rights, for example, cultural differences and actually concrete circumstances. There was a lot of complaint about the violation of human rights to force one family per child. But if that policy was not implemented, China would be over 2 billion people now. Who will feed them? Who will educate them? So there are concrete circumstances and very pragmatic issues that have to be addressed.
Okay. Gentleman in the beard, I said, yep, if you want to stand up and get the mic.
Do you think it is good practice for the Chinese government to have full control over the information its citizens view online?
Do you take a sneaky peek at the rest of the internet when you're in the UK?
No, I don't have any problems because I don't take sneaky peeks of things that I'm not interested in.
Okay.
So,
but in terms of his question, yes. Should the Chinese government control the flow of information to citizens?
I think there should be some measure of control, including in the United States.
But total control in China?
That should be lessened. That should be reduced.
You'd like to see it reduced in China?
Yeah.
Do you think it will be?
In some cases, it has been.
Okay. Let me ask you this. We're out of time, but I do want to ask you this. You were born in Taiwan, a capitalist society. You moved to the US. As a child, you studied at NYU and Princeton. You worked at the UN. But in 1975, I believe, you gave up your Taiwanese passport and your US green card to become a citizen of the People's Republic. What made you give up all those liberties and freedoms and move to China?
I felt quite oppressed in the US.
Okay.
I participated with Martin Luther King in the Civil Rights March in 1968.
Wow.
And against the war in Vietnam. And I had one of my fellow students at Princeton beaten to death by rednecks just because he was Chinese.
And you thought China was the place to go to get more?
No, I just thought if they don't want a Chinese, I'll just be Chinese.
And you participated in the MLK's protests, civil rights protests?
1968, yes.
Do you think those protests could ever happen in China?
I was actually shocked at how it took 200 years for the US to be addressing the issue of blacks sitting on the back of buses.
So China's behind in the timeline. You might get those protests, but not right now.
Well, I hope China doesn't have to have protests for these things to be addressed.
Well, the protests aren't allowed at the moment, is the point I'm making. You can't protest in China in any way. That's what you're avoiding.
No, there's plenty of protests in terms of even when the stock market crashed, people were protesting.
Charles Liu, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. Thanks to our audience here in the Oxford Union. Thanks to our panel. Thanks for watching. Thank you, Charles Liu. Thank you so much.